right, everybody. Welcome back to the AG Podcast. We are returning in Season 2. This is Episode 3. I am joined by Dr. Greg.
Dr. Greg Hummel.
Hello.
Dr. Greg and Pastor soon-to-be Dr. Phil.
Maybe. We'll see.
I'm amongst giants over here.
We believe. We
And
believe.
Yeah.
you, Master
Soon-to-be
Brian?
Master.
Yeah.
This is an educated table.
Yeah.
Or soon-to-be educated.
Beyond our...
Yeah. Soon to be educated.
Yeah, we are all here to gain from Greg's wisdom in his doctoral studies.
Well, we can just leave now.
Oh, how humble he is. Wow.
Yes.
Alrighty, it's great to be back with you guys. So today we are going to be going over some interesting facets of the Old Testament. So some of the questions that we've got from our congregation at home. First one is why do we as Christians follow the Ten Commandments but don't seem to need to follow all the other Old Testament laws?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Well, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll tell. We categorize the Old Testament Mosaic law, the laws of Moses, into three clusters or groups. The ceremonial laws, about the festivals and the sacrifices, those ceremonial laws. We also know the laws of diet, so the dietary laws, what they were supposed to eat, how they were supposed to eat it, and when they were supposed to eat it. And then also the moral laws about how to treat each other, how to honor God, how to live holy lives, and so the moral law. So Moses, we could add a fourth, maybe, the societal laws, how to treat each other, how not to take advantage of each other in the marketplace, how to not offend or hurt or, wound your neighbor, steal from them, so forth. As we look at those three or four categories, we do move into the New Testament, and we do find that today we don't follow all four of those groups or all three of those groups. We don't follow the ceremonial law of the Jews of the Old Testament. We don't follow the dietary laws of the Jews of the Old Testament. And to some degree, we don't follow the societal laws of the Old Testament. And so there's reasons why, and the Bible gives them to us. But just to start off, we would say clearly that something happened with Jesus that freed us from those laws so that they no longer are required of us. The Bible tells us that clearly Jesus, I think at the book of Romans, Romans chapter 10, verse 4, Christ is the end of the law. And so something happened with Jesus that freed everyone following him afterwards from having to do that same thing. But I think it's good, and Greg can talk a lot about this too, I think, but what's the purpose of Moses' law?
Yeah.
What was God trying to get at? What was he trying to do? And there are several key things God was trying to do. It wasn't simply to burden people.
Yeah.
God had every law purposeful, and because he's a God of grace and goodness, it was not just to burden people down. Off the top of my head, and Greg, you can add to this list, the purpose of the Mosaic Law was to demonstrate that God is holy, that he lives and acts and breathes and treats people righteously, and he lives righteously. So part of the purpose of Moses' laws were to tell the people of Israel that they serve a holy God. And he is a God worthy of honor. So that's one of the reasons.
Yeah, I think part of that is we don't understand. We're getting to understand more and more as our culture returns or degrades into idolatry and idol worship and all that. But there was a distinction to be made between the God of Israel and the pagan gods.
Yeah.
And I haven't done it with all of them, but just going with the 10 plagues that happened. Each of those plagues was an attack on a pagan god. So they were the Egyptians worshipped all of those frogs and the River Nile, and the light, death, the god of death. All those were attacks on paganism, and the distinction of Yahweh, the God of Israel, as against those. And a lot of the commands in the Old Testament that we don't understand because we don't have that background of paganism around us. But a lot of the ceremonies that they did, and a lot of the clothes that they wore, and a lot of the ways they reacted with each other was a firm contrast to what was going on in the pagan culture. And so it was meant to show the distinction of the God of Israel from all the other gods. And so there needed to be that kind of distinction made. Along with that, the Israelites were meant to be distinct. That's what the word holy comes down to. And the Israelites had to be completely different. If you're going to get, there is no real morality about wearing a piece of clothing that is made partly from wool and partly from cotton. There's no inherent badness to that.
Yeah.
But they weren't allowed to do it because people would say, why can't you wear two-materialed clothes? Because we're not like you. We're different, just like our God is different. And so it was really meant, part of it was to make a distinction and to attract the attention of the world. These people worship somebody that's completely different than everybody else. All these other gods, nobody is like Yahweh. Nobody. And look at his people. His people are different.
Yeah.
And some of the distinctions weren't really because of some inherent right or wrong to them. It was simply to make a distinction between them and the other people. Well, Israel does not perform that function anymore. And the church is to perform that function, but not by the clothes that we wear and the length of our beard and all that. It's a different kind of distinction that we're supposed to have.
Yeah.
So the need for that is not around anymore.
Yeah.
And so there's no... One commentator on the radio, he always says, I don't follow any of the Old Testament commands. I'm not under the law. But I don't do anything that Jesus told me not to do, and I do everything he told me to do because I'm under the new covenant, and so I follow Jesus. If Jesus said do it, I do it. If Jesus said don't do it, I don't do it. And Paul and the apostles. So that's he doesn't even, and I've had to think about this. Yeah, the Ten Commandments. I'm not bound to the Ten Commandments because that's part of the Old Testament law. But I am bound, and Jesus does repeat those in the New Testament. So he doesn't say I'm antinomian. I'm not against following rules. I'm just not going to subject myself to any of the laws of the Old Testament. I'm going to follow the new plan, and that's whatever Jesus said. Now, Jesus does repeat those.
Yeah.
And
right.
so that's
Yeah.
why we follow those.
Yeah.
I think too, like a third reason is because the law of Moses was given, so Paul says, so that they would understand sin, that they would understand that, if there's no laws that guide our life, we have no sense of guilt or sin. And so Paul tells us that God gave Israel the law to make sin a conscious part of their life. Okay, God said, "You shall not lie." So now, when they lied, now there's a consequence of guilt to that, because God's standard of holiness, I violated it, and so now there's I'm not perfect, I'm not good, I can't earn my way into God's grace. So the more laws there were, the easier it was to violate laws, therefore proving that you're not the perfect person that maybe you think you are.
Yeah.
And there's an awareness of sin, which then should lead to, what's God going to do with my sin? Okay. How am I going to how am I going to become justified or righteous in the sight of a holy God when I can't keep these laws and I realize I'm a sinner?
Yeah.
So that was the purpose of the law as well. So just like your little kids, when they're 3 years old, they don't understand what lying means. So the first time that they lie, you instruct them that no, that is a lie, and lying is bad, lying is sinful, lying hurts God's heart, and it hurts your relationships. The next time the child lies, all of a sudden there's an awareness that I'm doing something wrong. Okay, and that opens up the door to figuring out what am I supposed to do with that and how do I make that right.
Yeah.
So another reason for the law was to expose sin.
So even though we're brethren, Karis, can we have a fourth one?
We need a fourth one.
Yeah.
And there are aspects to the law that were just plain good for the people.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, just to benefit them. It is not good to have a society where people are lying to each other.
Right.
That society does not function when everybody lies to each other.
Right.
Society does not function when everybody has lust after their neighbor's wife or their neighbor's donkey or whatever it is. So, and some denominations and church groups say that the reason for some of the dietary laws was because pork was not a healthy, or shellfish was not healthy. And
Right.
now, that might be true. Nowhere does God say don't eat pork because it's bad for you. He doesn't do that. But maybe it was, and maybe God was just doing something to protect his people. So I think there are multiple reasons why the Old Testament law was given, but not all of those transport into today.
Yeah,
Right.
and I think too, the sacrificial laws allowed Israel to deal with their sin. If I lied and now I know I'm guilty, God also gave laws on how to rectify that, how to remedy that through this sacrifice. So we don't want to look down on any of the laws.
Right.
That's why Paul says the law is good. Jesus said the law is good. It's good to be aware when I have fallen short of God's holiness. It's good to be aware of how to remedy that as well. And so the way that God remedied it before Jesus is different than the way that God remedies it after Jesus. But he gave a prescription in the Old Testament of how they could remedy the result of their sins. So they could be, if they chose to, be in right standing with God.
Yeah.
And it was the same basis that it is today. It's the basis of faith, that God has told me this is a sin, I'm a sinner. God has told me this is the remedy, I do the remedy, and I do it because I'm trusting that God is true to his word. That's the faith I'm putting in him. And so in the New Testament, I put my faith and trust in the cross. And I'm trusting that although I wasn't at the cross, and the cross is to me a distant, mysterious thing, that's still the basis of my faith to find the remedy for my sin.
Yeah.
So it's not all that different. The focal points are different, but he switched at Jesus from making it the laws of Moses that guided my relationship now to the law of Jesus that guides my relationship.
You said this at the beginning. Jesus is the completion of the law, the fulfillment of the law. I don't think we understand everything that means, because I think the law, one of the main reasons of the law, besides everything else that we talked about, is to point to Jesus. I mean, there are, and I guess we'll wait for the seminary class in heaven for this, to find out how many of the laws, if we got into the nitty-gritty of them, point to Jesus.
Yeah.
Guys have gone crazy with the allegories in the Old Testament,
right.
and saying that all the different things in the tabernacle pointed to Jesus. Even the hooks that were like this, summoning you to come to the top, were all images of Jesus. But there's something that Jesus did with his disciples on the road to Emmaus, and I love this passage, where Jesus goes back to the very beginning and goes through the entire law of Moses and explains to his disciples how it related to him. And
Yeah.
they're walking, and he's starting with starting with Moses. He goes through the law and the prophets and says, these all pointed to me. Well, I'm wondering how many things we miss
Yeah.
of that law, that if we were really entrenched in that law, and I don't mean to follow the law or to be held accountable to that law, but to see, wow, look how many of those things Jesus referred to that we
Yeah.
don't even catch.
Yeah.
Or how many of those things, if we really knew the Old Testament laws and how rigorous it was and how impossible it was to complete it and all the detail. I mean, they talk about the length of the things that the priest is supposed to wear and the colors it's supposed to be and how the beard, and it's crazy.
Yeah.
Well, how can you follow that kind of detail? And Jesus says, all that points to me.
Yeah.
Wow. That's going to take an eternity to figure
Yeah, and I
that
think you
out.
see the same thing with Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch when Philip walks up to the chariot in the book of Acts, and he's reading from Isaiah. And Philip says, that tells us that Philip started in Isaiah and told this Ethiopian eunuch about Christ. So Jesus is in Isaiah, okay, and he's all the way through. So, and that's why I think if we look at the 30,000 foot level of the law in the Old Testament and how Christians live in the New Testament, I think we see a very similar pattern. Okay, there is something in place that reveals my sin. In the Old Testament, it's the law. Okay, there's something in place in the Old Testament to remedy that.
Yeah.
Okay, which was through sacrifice, and then there's something in place to help me continue that.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's where the beard and the Sabbath and all that comes in, because God wanted his people to live a holy life on a consistent basis, know when they stumbled in it and how to remedy it. And they did all of that through the law. In the New Testament, God still is calling us to live holy lives consistently. And when we stumble in that, what's the remedy for it?
Yeah.
Okay. And the remedy is different now than it was, but the Old Testament law was a great model of how to live a life of faith with God before Christ.
Yeah.
Okay. Live a holy life. I agree with Greg. Not only is it vertical in their relationship with God, but it's the best societal rules also. If you take the Ten Commandments, if you take the dietary laws, if you take the social laws, the societary laws, it creates the best society. So not only do they stand out among the other nations who are pagan and they're violating all the laws of Moses because their culture says it's okay, so it makes Israel stand out, it makes God stand out, but it's also the best for them amongst themselves, how they can flourish and prosper the best.
Yeah.
So, but the rhythm is the same. Be holy, and when you and know when you stumble and how to remedy your stumble. In the New Testament, be holy, know when you stumble, and how to remedy that stumble. We're doing it in two different ways that changed at Jesus. So we don't follow that way, and they would have never followed our way. Okay, because Jesus changed everything.
Yeah. And would it be reasonable to suggest that, a lot of these laws back then when Israel was in the wilderness, God was developing them as a nation. We know that God promised Abraham that he was going to complete their journey to the promised land. So is it reasonable to think that a lot of these laws too were situational for them going from completely in the wilderness to then established in the promised land?
Well, that's exactly what Deuteronomy is.
Right, because God dwelled within them, and God needed to dwell within them, but he could only dwell if sin was not in their camp. Because obviously we know with Achan, in Babylon, they were told not to do this by taking things for themselves. They did it, and God basically allowed them to suffer losses because of that. So some of these things where we can look at nowadays doesn't really necessarily apply to a Gentile Christian in 2025.
Right.
But back then, it was crucial for their survival and God's fulfilling his promise to them to bring them into the
Well, it
wilderness.
is interesting that even between Leviticus and Deuteronomy, you have differences.
Right.
Leviticus was they're wandering around in the desert. Deuteronomy, which means second law, it's adapted now to we're going to be living in a land. And there are some things that you do differently when you're a permanent resident or when you're wandering around in the wilderness. So
Right.
there was already an adaptation there about things that they didn't do the same. But the other thing is the morality behind it. And that's a question that you ask. Was this a law just so that we look distinct? Or is this a law that there's some principle that reveals what God likes and what God doesn't like? I don't know that the fact that they couldn't mix two kinds of thread in their clothes was because God prefers wool over cotton. I don't think that's really the
Maybe he
point.
just thinks it's ugly.
Yeah, well, it
Like,
could
that is
be.
not a good look, man.
Yeah.
That's in the law now. Don't like it.
I'm not sure he was revealing that he doesn't like cotton or wool blends. It was revealing something else, that God is distinct and we're supposed to be different and we don't do things like other people. That might be one of the reasons. So even when we look at the exact rules, we're not, we do this all the time. And we talked about this in my Sunday school class just this week and last week and the week before. We treat the rules like they're rules to be checked off rather than it's a relationship to be developed. And these rules reveal to us the person that we're to have a relationship with. And so the reason I check these off, I'm not doing them to check them off. I'm reading these laws and I'm trying to understand the person behind these laws because I want to have a relationship with him. So we asked this question in my class because we're going through the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And I asked, what if one of those is really lacking in your life? What should you do? And one person got it right, finally, but at least in my idea it was right. But they said, well, we need to start practicing that more. I said, no. If you're not demonstrating the fruit of the Spirit, number one, it's the fruit of whom? The Spirit. So why are you going to try and produce that fruit? It's the fruit of the Spirit. If I'm not loving enough, if I look at my life and I say, Greg, you're really not doing very well in the loving category. Oh, well, then I got to start loving more.
I love you. I love you. I love you.
That's not the key. What's the key? I need to get to know Jesus more.
Yeah.
Because if I know Jesus more and I hang out with Jesus more, I'm going to be more loving. And so I'm not going to check off, oh, I got to get busy with this loving thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, the loving thing reveals to me that the fruit of the Spirit is love. Okay, I'm not doing very well in that. Well, what's the answer? Well, start doing it. No. The answer is, well, I must not be hanging out with Jesus very much then. Because if I were hanging out with Jesus, he would rub off on me. The Spirit would produce it in me. And that's kind of what the problem was with the Pharisees in the Old Testament and the New Testament too. They were using the law as a checklist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas that's not what the purpose of the law was. Yes, it's a checklist to show you can't do it,
Right.
not a checklist to say you got to do it. And so when we're not loving and joyful and peaceful and patient and kind and good, well, I'm just going to start doing that. No, I must not be hanging out and having a close relationship with Jesus. Because if I were, these things would be produced in my life. So it's really a focus on relationship rather than on rules.
Yeah.
Well, and I think too, if you take that idea and go back to the Old Testament, where the example of the wool and the cotton garments that God required, why would I make them the way God required? Because I want to honor Him.
Right.
I want to love Him. So I may not see the value of that or the purpose of it necessarily, but God instructed us to do it this way. I'm in relationship with him, so I'm going to do it that way because I want to have this relationship. Some of the things that we see that come across on the surface as very extreme consequences for seemingly minor infractions, okay, like we know the story of people dying for seemingly little things of violating some Mosaic law. Well, most of the time what that would mean is that these people didn't want that relationship, and they were rebelling against that relationship, and they were intentionally violating the law because they wanted to run their own life and not have this relationship with God. And so God could justifiably say, well, then you're done. But again, that the models are very similar. Okay. I want to love God. Old Testament, New Testament, I want to love God. I want to know God, and I want to follow God. And here's how I do it. And when I stumble, here's how I deal with my stumbling. So,
And
I think the same
as
thing.
you pointed out, when you're new in the faith or a young believer or something, you need rules.
Yeah.
You don't understand. How do you learn what God likes and doesn't like? Well, you got to read the rules. You got to read the guidelines. You got to read the commandments. But if I'm just reading those to check them off, that's mistaking the purpose.
Right.
I read those so that I can understand God better. And so when I understand God, oh, this is what he likes, well, okay, then I'll do it. Not so I check it off and can be proud or boastful that I checked it off, or because I'm afraid if I don't, then he's going to get me. That's how people are in the beginning of a relationship, maybe. But as the relationship grows, there should be much less rule following and relationship building.
Yeah.
And
Yes, what you're saying is there's really, possibly three responses that we could have, but God tells us the response that he wants us to have. We could be like, oh, I need to check this off. Or if I don't do it,
I'm
then
in
I
trouble.
sacrifice.
Right.
Or what God says is I don't desire sacrifice, but a pure and contrite heart. And so his response, one response reveals relationship. Because if there's a pure and contrite heart about breaking the law and needing to sacrifice, that indicates that there's an awareness as to the severance or, damage to a relationship. Whereas be like, oh, I broke the law, do my sacrifice, that way I don't get in trouble.
Right.
Or that way God's going to keep blessing us, or whatever. And obviously the minor prophets, or the major prophets too, talk considerably about God telling them that you're getting it wrong. That's not what I want, but they just consistently, even in the Pharisees, kind of keep for some reason getting it wrong, where they're just like, give God the sacrifices and let's follow these rules, but God's consistently saying, this is not what I'm going for. And Jesus fulfills that in the sense of, so we come out of the New Testament and then Jesus is on the scene. He starts talking about the law, like you've heard it said, but this is what I mean, so that can help us maybe apply some discernment, to how we interact with the Old Testament law. So what are some ways that you think Jesus is on the scene, how he teaches interaction with the law? How does that help us interact with the Old Testament law? Because we don't want to just reject it outright, but obviously Jesus establishes a better way to handle it.
Yeah, well, when Jesus says that, you're talking about the Sermon on the Mount, I think he's specifically attacking the Pharisees because they had increased the law. Not only was it just the 613 commandments of the Old Testament, but they had increased it because they were better than that, which is really very prideful. Well, if God says we have to do 613, well, I'm going to do 727 because I can be better than that. Well, that's crazy. That's prideful. So Jesus, when he says you've heard it said, he doesn't say you've read in the Old Testament, because he's not quoting the Old Testament. He's quoting the popular culture. He's quoting the Pharisees' standards. You've heard it said. In other words, the Pharisees teach this. I'm telling you what really needs to happen. So, and each of those he's pointing to really the morality or the relationship behind
Right.
the law. And it's the same thing he does with the Sabbath when they're walking through, and they get attacked because the disciples are threshing grain. They're not threshing grain. They're just grabbing stuff off the stalk and rubbing it to eat it. But that's forbidden by the Pharisees. They weren't doing work. They were they were just walking through the field and eating. But that's where Jesus says, you guys have turned a relationship into a rule following thing. The purpose of the Sabbath is to have relationship with God. And I think he would have said, and the disciples are hanging out with me, and guess who I am?
Right.
So we're doing, the purpose of the Sabbath was to have a relationship with God. Well, I'm walking through the field with my disciples, can't have much more of a relation. They're relating to God right now. You guys are trying to turn this into some kind of a rule thing.
Yeah.
And the purpose of the Sabbath or any of the other laws was not to have a checklist, but it was to develop a relationship. And so he says that the purpose of the Sabbath was not to put a burden on you. It was to actually enjoy it and have a rest. And what you do when you're resting is you're fellowshipping with God.
Well, save your thoughts on the Sabbath because that's part of our question later on.
Yeah. But I do think too, at the same time, you know, that pattern in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, "You heard this, but this is what I say. You heard this, this is what I say." It is changing it from doing the right thing to doing the right thing for the right reasons.
Right.
And that was relationship. So it was frequently in the Old Testament, the children of Israel got reprimanded because sometimes they were doing the right thing, but they were doing it for the wrong reasons.
Right.
You said it well. They're just checking a box. There's no desire to love God or follow God or live holy. I just, I don't want God to slap me on the back of the head, so I better make my sacrifice. Not because I feel bad for lying or I feel bad for taking advantage of the poor. I want to be able to do all that stuff, but I don't want God to smack me on the back of the head, so I better do this stuff. And Jesus switches it all to saying, no, this is all relational, and not only relational. It's most of the changes were internal. Going from an outside rule follower to an inside passionate, devout follower of Jesus.
Yeah.
So that's a distinction between old and new. I think the other distinction is that the Old Testament, and this might play well, it may not, but God said in the Old Testament He covers sin. He doesn't wipe away sin, because something else happened at Jesus when Jesus came. Is that the sin that was atoned for through the sacrifices was a sin that was covered, and then after Jesus, we see that the sin is forgiven and forgotten.
Yeah,
and
Hebrews
away.
talks about that.
Okay? Yeah.
Hebrews talks about the blood of bulls and goats can never do away with sin.
Yeah.
It was a covering. It was a good covering. It was not that it was a second-rate covering. Well, compared to Jesus, it was a second-rate
all
covering.
they had, yeah.
But it was what God had established.
Yeah, it was
as,
His plan
as
for
the
that
covering.
time.
So
Right.
it was good,
Right.
but it wasn't permanent.
Right.
And that's what whoever wrote Hebrews,
Right.
Priscilla or whoever wrote Hebrews says is. Sorry, is
Greg, easy. Cut that up, please.
Yeah,
No,
yeah.
I'm just kidding.
is that to think that covering really could do away with sin, you're not thinking straight. There's no way for the blood of bulls and goats to actually pay for our sin in a permanent sense.
Right.
Yeah.
In a temporary sense, makes perfect sense, but not in a forever sense.
Well, it seems. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
And that's what makes Jesus' sacrifice perfect, is that it really does away with it, and it doesn't have to be repeated.
Yeah.
So the Hebrews goes right along with what you're saying there. So.
And I, just kind of summarize, I think you're right, Brian. I think it's the Old Testament laws were instituted by God to build a relationship with Him, okay, according to the era in which they lived, okay, before Jesus. The law itself was good, you know. The rules were good. They were good rules. They weren't ridiculous rules. And there were rules to follow and then ways to remedy if you didn't follow them. Why do we follow them today and not follow some of them today? That's a different question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now we're on to the scene of the early church. So Jesus, we have the Old Testament law. Now we have Jesus kind of coming in and maybe not redefining, but maybe establishing the reasons for relationship behind the law as to why the pharisaical, legalistic interaction with the law is not cutting it. So the early church is formed, and this question we maybe not think about so much now, but I feel like this question was the question for the early church because most of them were Jews now spreading the gospel to the Greek and Asian surrounding areas who were not culturally Jewish or even religiously Jewish, but completely new to this faith. And so in Acts, we see a lot of tension with this kind of question of these people are not circumcised. What do we do with these people? And I think it's Acts 15 where they kind of have that council to answer this question. So, what do you guys, does this council, which says basically that we abstain from sexual immorality, from blood, I can't remember the other two, there's I think 4 of them. But is that kind of our go-to to determine, kind of sever our maybe need to follow these Old Testament laws as Gentile believers?
Well, I think part of that decision, because Acts is transitional. It really is.
Right, yeah.
And there were things that I think don't necessarily apply strictly to us right now, because Paul was willing to make a compromise. In some places, later on, he says, we know that meat sacrificed to idols means nothing. But I think in Acts 15, he makes that compromise. He says, okay, I'll tell the guys not to eat that meat sacrificed to idols. But it wasn't for them, it was for the Jewish people. Because the Jews, that was so
It was violating their conscience.
so terrible for them.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
How can
Yeah.
you have a body of Jews and Gentiles where these guys, it means nothing to them to eat meat sacrificed, but to the Jews, it's like, I can't do that. And so Paul says, well, let's make a compromise. We won't do it when you're around.
Yeah.
When you're around.
Well,
We'll
yeah,
do it some
yeah,
other time.
yeah. I mean, this is so complex. in a
But
way.
we don't
Yeah.
want to put any kind of stumbling block, because Paul's whole idea was, I'm not going to be any kind of a stumbling block to anybody.
Right.
And so if we have to do away with that, but it wasn't, I don't think it was to check off boxes. There was relationship there, and they're trying to figure out, how do we mix two enemies? How do we make one people out of enemies? Well, there's going to have to be give and take. And so some of the decisions that are made in Acts, I think, are compromises, just pure compromises that they had to do.
Conscience compromises.
Yeah, conscience compromises.
yeah.
Because and Paul says later, there is no real big deal about eating meat sacrificed to idols.
Right.
But he was willing to make a compromise in Acts 15. I think that's because he saw it was better for them. And he made the same compromise. Wasn't his compromise, was it Timothy's compromise?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
circumcision.
Yeah.
Paul
Right.
in Galatians, he's mad that people are requiring circumcision. And he says, no, you can't do this. And then he goes and he circumcises Timothy.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah.
Because of compromise.
Yeah.
But it's not a moral
No.
compromise.
Yeah. It's a conscience.
It's a
compromise.
conscience compromise to not put stumbling blocks in front of other people.
Yeah.
So I don't think I'm not going to say Paul ever compromised his moral
Yeah.
position,
Yeah.
but he
No,
did
yeah.
compromise.
Well, obviously back then it must have been so big of an issue
Yeah.
that there was no way forward but
Yeah.
to just kind of.
I-
And obviously with 4,000 years of history following one way, and now we're being told not anymore, not necessarily anymore. I'm
Yeah.
sure that's kind of.
Right.
I think that probably a lot of their identity and what they knew to be religious comprised of them following the law.
Right.
But again, always falling short of that relational aspect because God talks about us as the church now and talked about Israel back then as being his bride. You know, and following the law in a way should be done like Pastor Phil was saying, of like it's a relational thing, not because I don't want to be disciplined, but because I share the love for you like you have for me as a husband and wife do, to where you wouldn't call a good marriage as somebody being like, well, the wife wants this and I'll just whatever.
Well,
You
I
know
think
what I
we could, if you today flipped it, okay, where let's say you grew up in a Christian environment, you walk in freedom in Christ, but then you marry somebody that is a Greek Orthodox Christian, okay, where they still put Jesus at the center of salvation, but every Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, every morning, every evening, every time you sit down for a meal, there are rituals to go through. Okay. How big of an adjustment would that be for us? Okay. Like saying this load, this change is so cumbersome for me to walk with God. Okay. That's how radical this new Christianity thing was.
Right.
Like, I don't have to keep the Sabbath. I don't have to circumcise. I don't have to wash my hands before I do this. I don't have to abstain from that. Okay.
I can eat bacon.
I can, I mean, that's Acts 10, Peter the sheep, the animals come down. 3 times God had to tell him. So in my mind, like, how do we distinguish the difference between Old Testament and New Testament? One of the ways I like to look at it is in the New Testament, there are things we're clearly told we don't have to follow anymore. Okay. So if the New Testament clearly tells me I don't have to follow that particular set of laws, then I'm free not to. Okay. I don't get to just pick and choose. The accusation when people ask the question, why do Christians follow some of the Old Testament laws and not others? The accusation almost comes across like you guys just pick and choose whatever you want to do. Okay. In reality, that's not true at all. You know, we know that in Colossians 2:16, don't let anyone judge you regard to food or drink. Okay. Well, in the Old Testament, you were highly judged by your food and drink. Okay. So that verse there sets us free from the dietary restrictions of the Old Testament. Okay. And then he goes on to say, or respect to festivals or a new moon. So the ceremonies of the Old Testament, Mosaic law, Paul says, I'm free from that. Okay. So I'm not making stuff up off the top of my head. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. I don't want to eat this. I'm clearly told I don't have to follow that anymore. Okay. And then, or of a Sabbath day. Okay. I think my own personal opinion is the Sabbath preceded the Mosaic law. The Sabbath was part of the creation week. So I do think God would desire for us to have a weekly Sabbath. But do I do it on Thursday? Do I do it on Friday? Do I do it on Sunday? I don't think I can be held to account on which day it is, because perhaps I work on Sunday, or I do work on Sunday. Sunday is not my Sabbath. Right. The Sabbath was not the priestly rest day because they're working.
Right. Yeah.
So we can't be super legalistic about it. But how do we set ourselves free from the Old Testament ceremonial law? How do we set ourselves free from the Old Testament dietary laws? How do we set ourselves free from some of the societal laws? Because the New Testament says we're free from it. Okay?
I just thought that made sense, too, that Sabbath. For Israel, it would not function as a nation to have everybody choose what day of the week was going to be Sabbath.
That's true. That's true.
You just, okay, Brian, you take tomorrow off.
Yeah.
I'll take the next day. You couldn't do for Israel to function as a nation and to represent God well and be distinct from it. You had to have a Sabbath,
Right.
Yeah.
So
Had to go for everybody.
you had to.
Yeah.
You cannot run. And Israel still today basically nationally observe a Sabbath.
Yeah.
But
So-
it wouldn't. But there are a lot of people that don't. There are still
Yeah.
people that work in the hotels and
Yeah.
everything. So there, you had to have, but it wasn't meant to be okay. It has to be on the seventh day of the week,
Yeah.
or it's a rest.
Right.
That's what the word Sabbath means. I think it's rest. Break,
So, when it comes to the moral laws, the Ten Commandments, so to speak, most of them are reiterated in the New Testament. Okay, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. So that's commandment number 1 of the Ten Commandments. And so Jesus reiterates that. Paul reiterates, honor your father and mother. Okay, Paul reiterates, don't lie to one another, don't steal from one another, don't covet your neighbor's wife. So I know that the moral laws are still in place because the New Testament tells me they're still in place. Okay, so I think we have to get away from this idea that Christians themselves are choosing which laws to follow and which laws not to follow. The New Testament clearly gives me the guidelines for that.
Yeah. Alrighty, we are going to pause the episode right here. Hopefully you guys have been enjoying our conversations around the Old Testament laws. Keep in tune because we are going to be continuing our discussion and talking about the Sabbath as well. So we'll see you guys next week. Have a good one.